Good morning, I'm Joe Fryer.
And I'm Savannah Sellers. Right now, breaking news on Morning News Now. Fallen. Afghanistan now squarely under Taliban control. How unrelenting insurgent advances on the country's largest cities erased 20 years of American wartime efforts and billions of U.S. dollars in the past week. What's next for this embattled country and the security of the U.S.? We have the latest on the deteriorating situation on the ground. Crisis situation. President Biden now sending thousands of U.S. troops back into Afghanistan to aid civilian withdrawal. How the Taliban takeover happened faster than any U.S. estimates and how it could spell political disaster for the White House. Also this morning, devastation. More than 1,000 people are dead and thousands more hurt after a massive earthquake in Haiti. Rescue crews are now scrambling to find survivors in the rubble in the midst of chaos in that country. A tropical storm is bearing down. Medical crews are fighting the pandemic with a shortage of coronavirus vaccines. And the country is still reeling after a brazen assassination of its president last month. And passport to play. New vaccination rules go into effect in New York City. People required to show proof of vaccination to get into some indoor spaces. We'll have more on this groundbreaking new program, first of its kind, and whether we could see this rolled out in other parts of the U.S. We're going to get right to that breaking news this morning. Overnight and a dramatic weekend in Afghanistan where the Taliban has taken control after seizing the capital, Kabul, unopposed following the government's collapse as President Ashraf Ghani fled the country. The fall of Kabul marks the final stage of a lightning campaign by the militant group, sweeping the nation in a matter of weeks, catching the U.S. off guard and forcing an urgent evacuation of embassy staff.
On Sunday, Secretary of State Antony Blinken defended the president's decision to pull out U.S. troops. Speaking on NBC's Meet the Press, Blinken blamed the Afghan military for the rapid Taliban takeover.
The inability of Afghan security forces to defend their country has played a very powerful role in what we've seen over the last few weeks. The fact is, we invested, the international community invested over 20 years, billions of dollars in these forces, 300,000 of them, with an air force, something the Taliban didn't have, with the most modern, sophisticated equipment. And unfortunately, tragically, they have not been able to defend the country. And I think that explains why this has moved as quickly as it's moved.
The State Department says the U.S. military is now in control of Kabul's airport, where embassy personnel are awaiting evacuation. But they're not the only ones trying to leave. Hundreds of Afghans flooded the civilian side of the airport, desperately trying to board planes out of the country. We have a team of reporters standing by to bring us more on all these events. NBC News correspondent Ali Arouzi is in Tehran. White House correspondent Mike Memoli is near Camp David, where the president is currently staying. And Capitol Hill correspondent Garrett Hake is also with us from Washington. Plus, we'll be joined shortly by retired Admiral James Stravidis. Let's start with Ali. He's in Tehran monitoring the latest developments in the region. Ali, what is the latest at Kabul airport? How soon before we know all the embassy staff can get out of the country?
Hey, Joe. Well, there are scenes of panic and pandemonium at Kabul airport today as desperate people pour onto the runway trying to flee the country in what can only be described as a chaotic exodus. People are literally clinging onto U.S. military aircrafts as they try to take off. The U.S. is in charge of the airport, but their focus is on the evacuation of American personnel. As far as commercial flights go, it's a disorderly mess with little security around them. We know that as of last night, the U.S. military had flown around 500 embassy personnel out of the country on military aircraft. Now, they're working up to a capacity of several thousand out per day, but they won't have that capability for a few days yet. As for the Afghans that have worked on various roles for the U.S., it's going to be a much tougher way to get out. Commercial flights, as we can see, are already problematic. There are hundreds of them stranded stranded at the airport with their suitcases and whatever other belongings they could muster. And just getting to the airport from a far-flung location in Afghanistan means having to run a very dangerous gauntlet across the country that could cost you your life. There are also unconfirmed reports that we can't confirm that 5 people have been killed at the airport under unclear circumstances. It could have been gunfire. It could have been a stampede. It's so chaotic there right now. The facts are still dripping out.
You know, Ali, last week, U.S. intelligence officials said it could be months before Kabul falls. In reality, it took much shorter than that, just one day to topple Kabul. How was the Taliban able to capture the capital and really the country so easily?
Well, Joe, there are many contributing factors that we could discuss and dissect for days to come, but ultimately it comes down to a tale of two armies. The Afghan army and security forces that until yesterday were about 300,000 strong, and the Taliban with about 75,000, 80,000 fighters. Now, despite being trained and equipped by the U.S. military, receiving intelligence and air support, the Afghan army didn't really have a fighting chance once the US and NATO weren't propping them up, because they simply weren't as motivated as the Taliban, who were very motivated. They made up for their lack of equipment with huge doses of motivation and discipline. Nor were the Afghan army willing to fight to the death as opposed to the Taliban, and that's why they were so easily able to take over a country of 38 million people.
And Ali, do we know what are the Taliban's plans now that they're in control of the country? What could the future look like for its people?
Well, a Taliban spokesman this morning said that the type of rule and form of the regime will be clear soon. He said that they will lay out a manifesto of what they're planning on how they're planning on running the country. But looking at their past record, it doesn't look very promising for the Afghan people. Look, the Taliban reigned over a tyrannical period in Afghanistan, some of its darkest period. They haven't shown much signs of changing their attitudes in the last 20 years. So we can expect a much more repressive regime again in Afghanistan, with social reforms rolled back, especially for women. I've spoken to several Afghan women this morning who are in Iran right now, and they said the country is going to be a prison for women once again, as it was 20 years ago. The big question also, Joe, is are the Taliban going to allow the country to be a breeding ground, a training ground for terrorists like Al-Qaeda in the past? If they do that, we may see more conflict with Afghanistan. If they keep a low profile, they'll probably stay in power for some time to come.
Ali Arouzi highlighting two of the biggest worries right now. Thank you for your reporting. Appreciate it, Ali.
Now, as the world watches the dramatic scene on the ground in Afghanistan, the Pentagon is now sending an additional 1,000 troops to Afghanistan. That decision now brings the total number of troops to 6,000 to assist with the evacuation of embassy personnel. President Biden is facing intense pushback for his administration's handling of the drawdown of troops, with hundreds of protesters gathering outside the White House Sunday afternoon. Let's now bring in our Washington team for more on the fallout. Mike, good morning. I know that you are actually near Camp David, where President Biden was this weekend on what was supposed to be somewhat of a vacation, but we have not heard much. What and when do we expect to hear from President Biden on this?
Well, certainly that is the question, Savannah. It's striking that we have not heard from President Biden on camera in nearly a week. It was last Tuesday that he left the White House for what comes as close as a president can ever get to a vacation over these past 2 weeks now. But what we have seen from the White House is a series of readouts of the president's ongoing briefings. We were told he's been briefed on a daily basis, multiple times a day, by his senior leadership team, also consulting with our allies. And we are hearing from the president in the form of a paper statement in which he says this: when I became president, I faced a choice: follow through on the deal with a brief extension to get our forces and our allies out safely, or ramp up our presence and send more American troops to fight once again in another country's civil conflict. And as we've heard from the president several times, he says, I was the fourth president to preside over an American troop presence in Afghanistan, and I will not pass this on to a fifth. White House officials are not ruling out the possibility that the president will leave Camp David, return to Washington to address the nation about developments here. But two big questions. When exactly will that happen? How quickly? And what will the president say? Certainly a lot of questions about how he's handled this drawdown.
Absolutely. Mike, stick with us. I've got another question for you in just a moment. Garrett, good morning. Let me bring you in here. President Biden has been getting heavy criticism. As I mentioned, there were those protests, but also from Republicans and even some Democrats there in D.C. What are they saying? And has he actually received any notable support?
Well, look, this conflict had been on the back burner for Congress for quite some time, and members, I think, were surprised at the speed at which things deteriorated here, and Republicans in particular were furious, castigating the president for making a decision to leave the country irrespective of conditions on the ground. Some of these lawmakers had been critical of former President Trump's plan to do the same thing. Others had said very little when this had happened or when discussions of this issue had happened during the previous administration. But watching the pictures out of Kabul, particularly Republicans seized on the moment and pointed out that we were essentially leaving so many of our Afghan partners behind. Here's Republican Mike McCall, who's the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, discussing this on one of the Sunday shows over the weekend. Listen.
Since the decision was made in May, I think it's an unmitigated disaster of epic proportions. And I think the president, this is going to be a stain on this president and his presidency. And I think he's going to have blood on his hands for what they did.
Democrats didn't rush to defend Biden on the situation in Afghanistan, which I think speaks to the complicated politics here. Many of the statements that we did see were qualified in their criticism or in their viewpoint. Chris Murphy, for example, who's a fairly senior member on the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, put out a statement in which he focuses on the fact that what we need to see now is this orderly evacuation of Kabul, and that we need to make sure that both our embassy personnel and our allies in Afghanistan are safely removed from the country. Only then, he argues, can we really judge the success or failure of this. But Murphy makes the point, as did several other Democrats, that leaving Afghanistan was always going to be the right thing to do, and that there was never going to be a good time to do it. So the statements from Democrats defending the president, I think, are trying to look hopefully a little bit over the horizon to see what this all looks like in perhaps several days or a week or so after what they hope will be a fairly orderly drawdown of Americans and allies is completed.
Garrett, the lower third there, the banner across the bottom of that soundbite that you just played for us there actually tees me up very well for this next question for Mike, which is just about exactly how quickly this has happened and what the reaction there is, the White House. I mean, that was just yesterday morning, you said on a Sunday show. And the lower third there said that the Taliban was at the gates of Kabul. Of course, we know in just less than 24 hours that situation has dramatically changed for the worse. So, Mike, what is the reaction of the White House? We know we haven't heard from President Biden, but, you know, he's said in the past, he's stressed, you mentioned it, that the future of this country is up to its citizens and really the Afghan military. We saw, though, how quickly this happened. What's the White House's reaction to that?
Yeah, Savannah, it was 4 months ago, almost exactly, that the president delivered his address outlining his plans to follow through on the President Trump decision to remove U.S. forces from Afghanistan. And he addressed it again just last month. And in both speeches, he underscored the sophistication of the training, the equipment that we've been giving to the Afghan national forces over 20 years of our involvement there. And the word from the White House at this point about why this happened so quickly is essentially this. We spent 20 years giving them the most sophisticated equipment, the best training in the world. But what we couldn't give them was the will to fight for their country. And that's what we're seeing play out, where in so many of these cities, the Taliban has entered without much of a fight. And given the undercurrent of the weakness of the Afghan government throughout this process, there was little, even in the worst case scenarios that were outlined to this administration, that predicated it being this fast. Now the question is, does the president follow through on the full withdrawal, or is there going to need to be a consistent stabilization of the airport, for instance, as we're seeing now, for the foreseeable future?
And I think that what we just heard from our colleague Ali Arouzi there, the fact that we had the numbers and the equipment was given to the Afghan military, and yet that's what we're seeing. Mike and Garrett, thank you so much for joining us on this big morning.
For more on this developing situation, let's bring in NBC News Chief International Security and Diplomacy Analyst, retired Admiral James Stravidis. He's also the former Supreme Allied Commander at NATO. Admiral, good to have you with us. So President Biden, his top officials, had said the Afghan military would be able to handle the Taliban, they thought. He also said the situation would not be like the U.S. exit from Vietnam at the end of that war, the fall of Saigon. Here's just some of what he said last month.
The Taliban is not the North Vietnamese army. They're not remotely comparable in terms of capability. There's going to be no circumstance where you see people being lifted off the roof of an embassy of the United States from Afghanistan. It is not at all comparable.
And yet we saw the images of helicopters hovering over the embassy unfolding on live TV yesterday. I mean, in your mind, was there a way that this situation, the rapid takeover by the Taliban, the quick evacuation by the U.S., could it have been avoided?
Well, first of all, is this a Saigon moment? You know, I'm old enough to actually remember Saigon. 1975, I was a midshipman at the U.S. Naval Academy. And unfortunately, this is very much like Saigon. In fact, it's worse than Saigon in the sense that it's happened so quickly. Could it have been prevented? I don't think so, given what we now know about the rotten core inside the Afghan security forces, which we did not see coming. So overall, I think it could have been handled better by keeping forces longer in place. But once the administration made the decision to pull everybody out by August 31st, I think that was like waving a red flag in front of the Taliban. They moved out, and unpredictably, from our perspective, the Afghan security forces collapsed. Pretty hard to wind that clock back in any other way.
Talking about what we could have maybe predicted, our colleagues Ken Delaney and Courtney Cuby are now reporting that U.S. intelligence officials are denying there was an intelligence failure to anticipate the collapse of the Afghan government. But two sources tell NBC News this is going worse than even the worst case scenario they saw in intelligence assessments, which was that the Taliban could take Kabul by September 11th. It's now August 16th. So in your mind, I mean, how much of this was an intelligence failure? How much of it was just, military leadership and planning?
I think there is plenty of blame to go around here, starting with the lack of imagination. In other words, we often say about 9/11 itself, the terrorist attack that precipitated us going to Afghanistan was not only a failure of intelligence, certainly there's a portion of that, but a failure of imagination. You've got to be able to push beyond the boundaries of what you conventionally think. And I, for one, and many others who have been observing this for a long time, I commanded this mission for 4 years, about a decade ago, could not have imagined this sudden collapse. So certainly there's an intelligence component to this. There's also a failure by the U.S. military, active duty military, including me, to train the Afghan security forces right. There's a failure of policy in that the administration pulled out too precipitously. There's a failure on the part of the Afghan government, as we've talked about. So I think there's plenty of failure to go around. We need to analyze it, study it, learn from it. We've made mistakes here. Let's not repeat them.
Admiral Stravidis, we thank you for your candor and for your expertise this morning. Thanks so much.
In just 8 days, the Taliban have seized control of a majority of Afghanistan's cities and towns after 20 years of war, 4 U.S. presidents, and more than 2,400 American lives lost. Veterans wonder what it was all for. NBC News correspondent Megan Fitzgerald has more.
More than 2,400 flag-draped coffins returned home from Afghanistan. The nation honoring our heroes who sacrificed it all in America's longest war, starting in 2001 when the World Trade Towers were attacked.
We will stay until the mission is done.
The mission to defeat al-Qaeda and kill its leader, Osama bin Laden, ultimately accomplished, driving out the Taliban and building an Afghan government that can survive on its own.
We will stand with you as you defend your new democracy.
It was a commitment lasting 20 years, costing the U.S. more than $2 trillion.
Americans' commitment to you and to a secure, stable, and unified Afghanistan, that remains firm.
Afghans will secure and build their own nation. and define their own future.
We have trained and equipped a standing force of over 300,000 Afghan personnel today.
More than 600,000 troops deployed multiple times, working to train the Afghan army as American military leaders promised they would one day be ready.
The bulk of this country today is permissive, it's secure.
We are building Afghan security forces that are on track to take the lead for securing the entire country.
They have capable ground, air, and special operations forces.
But only weeks after most U.S. troops pulled out of the country, defeat.
How do you feel about what's happening in Afghanistan right now?
I'm brokenhearted about it. I hate to think that everything we did out there was in vain.
Denise Giannette's son was a medic who served 4 years in Afghanistan and was killed on the front lines. Her son and his comrades will always be heroes. They fought to help a country that was unable to help themselves. Megan Fitzgerald, NBC News.
The Taliban takeover of the Afghan presidential palace all but solidifies their control over the country.
Yes, and now Afghans worry the lives they built over the last 20 years will be dismantled. Women, especially, were given entirely new opportunities and new hope. A new piece on NBCNews.com puts it this way. Journalists, intellectuals, activists, and prominent women, those who may have believed that Afghanistan could in some small way model a Western democracy, are in mortal danger.
Joining us now is the author of that piece, NBC News senior reporter Brinley Bruton. Brinley, thanks so much for joining us. You're reporting not only on the women in Kabul, but also what your friends are experiencing. I know you're in touch with some of those friends. What is the situation like for them now? Do they know what they're going to do next?
Mostly they don't know what they're going to do next. Those who are trying to get out of the country, you've seen the scenes from the airport, are stuck. There are other people who don't know whether to even go to work. A woman I know works as a journalist, and she just feels that, you know, if she goes to work, she could be targeted on her way to work. She could be targeted at work. The Taliban could raid the newsroom, which it's done. A man I know, you know, he gets multiple calls from his wife every day. She wants to know if he's alive. His sons ask him, you know, are you going to come back alive? So people don't know what to do. They can't get money out of ATMs. There's no government. There's nothing there. Those people who supported the Western supported government don't know who to turn to even. The Americans are leaving. Everyone else in the coalition is leaving.
And Brinley, your piece highlights, you know, so much of what we've been talking about this morning, which were these promises made, and then, of course, so much money spent by the U.S. And now we ultimately know that in just a matter of days, really, the Taliban has taken over the country again. We've heard President Biden say, we've heard presidents before him say that we can't stay in the country indefinitely. But what would the people on the ground that you're speaking to, your friends, the people who are scared, frankly, as you're saying, what would they want?
Well, to be honest, some Afghans have been critical of the American-backed government for a long time. So what they would have wanted, what they say they want, is support in forcing the government to do a better job. I worked with journalists there, and they've been breaking stories on inefficiency, corruption, injustice. So they were hoping that, you know, the world's remaining superpower would support them in their fight for that. These are people who took on board the message that democracy and a well-run government is the best, is the way to go. And so they're not blind to the problems in Afghanistan. On the contrary, they wanted help, or the people I know want help resolving these issues. And they see the Americans and other Western countries as a big problem. It's a big part of the problem because it's, you know, one of the things that enabled corruption, these huge amounts of money that went into Afghanistan. Not that they're being ungrateful, but they see politicians becoming extremely rich. And, on average, Afghans, recent statistics show that poverty rates have gone up. So they wanted support to attain that sort of democratic ideal, if you see what I mean. I don't think they envisioned an American occupation forever.
All right. Brindley Bruton, thank you so much for your reporting. Please check out our piece at NBCnews.com.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you. The United States isn't the only country evacuating embassy personnel. Others around the world are reducing their diplomatic footprint in the wake of the Taliban takeover. In the UK, Prime Minister Boris Johnson called for a joint response to the events in Afghanistan.
We don't want anybody bilaterally recognizing the Taliban. We want a united position amongst all the like-minded as far as we can get one, so that we do whatever we can to prevent Afghanistan lapsing back into being a breeding ground for terror.
NBC News foreign correspondent Molly Hunter joins us now from London. Molly, good morning. So the UK has, of course, been a major partner to the U.S. during this war in Afghanistan. So first, just tell us, what's the reaction been like there to what we've seen play out over the last few days, and what are the government's plans?
Hey, guys, good morning. Right. They've been a big partner. They've been as involved as the U.S. and certainly their priorities, their reactions this morning are very similar to the U.S. So they are trying to get their personnel out, and they are trying to get Afghans who worked with the U.K. government, military and civil society, and, of course, in their embassy out as well. Now, the U.K. defense minister spoke this morning. He said they're aiming for about 4,000 people by the end of the month. Not as quickly as he hoped. He said some people will be left behind, and he says the delays in actually getting people out apparently are going to be up to actually processing all of that paperwork, not actually capacity on those planes. Now, Prime Minister Boris Johnson, you just heard, he called for a unified response. He's also called Parliament back from summer vacation for an emergency session on Wednesday, and I think we're going to hear a lot more from the UK government, of course, in the next 2 days.
Molly, let's now also turn to America's rivals. So China and Russia are among those that are actually keeping their embassies open. Do we have any indication what that means their plans are in Afghanistan under Taliban rule?
Yeah, Savannah, at least keeping their embassies open for now. So our colleague Janice Mackey-Freyer reports that the Chinese Foreign Ministry says it's willing to forge what they call a friendly relationship with the Taliban in Afghanistan. Now, Janice followed up to ask if that meant recognition of the Taliban as the legitimate government. She didn't get a clear answer. As for Russia, Russia says they are in contact with the Taliban. They are keeping their embassy open. They say they are certainly going to send some people at least on a summer vacation, but they're not calling it an evacuation. We'll certainly keep our eye on both of those in coming days.
Yes, definitely. Molly, thank you so much.
Coming up, another big story. Search and rescue efforts underway in Haiti growing more urgent after that massive earthquake strikes the country.
Crews are working to find more people in the rubble as a tropical storm barrels toward them. A report on the situation there next.
The death toll in Haiti is still rising after a magnitude 7.2 earthquake struck the island on Saturday. Now, teams are racing to rescue survivors trapped under collapsed buildings. Nearly 1,300 people were killed in the disaster, with another 5,700 people injured. That number is expected to rise as rescuers search through debris. The hospitals that remain standing, officials say they're struggling to keep up with the flow of injured patients. Haiti is still recovering from that major earthquake that struck the island 11 years ago. The COVID pandemic, coupled with an economic collapse and a political crisis, have all left the island with extremely limited resources. Neighboring countries, including America, are now rushing to get supplies on the ground. NBC News reporter Ed Ogostin joins us now from nearby Havana, Cuba, with more. So, Ed, the U.S. sent aid overnight to assist in the recovery efforts. What more can you tell us about the search and rescue mission there, and how's that American aid going to help?
Yeah, 65 Americans on a search and rescue mission touched down in Haiti last night. They are carrying walkie-talkies and bringing 4 canines with them as they're going to be assisting Haitian civilians mainly, but also state search and rescue workers as they try and find more people who are under the rubble. We have 7,000 buildings that are confirmed to have collapsed, likely more, and they're going to be participating in the search and rescue efforts. The American team touching down, there's already 253 Cuban doctors who were in the country prior to the earthquake who on Saturday moved south towards the disaster zone, who've been working in hospitals in that region, both in hospitals and outside hospitals because they're way over capacity, that have been operating people trying to clean out wounds. And there are more countries talking about helping in different ways.
And on top of all this, Tropical Storm Grace is expected to make landfall in Haiti tonight. How is the country preparing for this storm? How might it impact the already dire situation there following the earthquake?
One bad thing after another. Tropical depression Grace due to hit Haiti. Not only Haiti, the south of Haiti, the epicenter of the earthquake, later on today during the evening. And that is only going to layer on another level of worry and possibly calamity. Obviously, tropical depressions, tropical storms bring winds with them, can bring flooding. In a place like Haiti, where over the years there's been mass deforestation, landslides that can be deadly are also an issue. And we have thousands of people sleeping outside now, not only because 7,000 houses have confirmed to have crumbled, but also because people are quite rightly scared of the tremors after the quake. Some of the tremors the day after the quake were 5.2 on the Richter scale. So people are terrified. And then you put on top of that memories of the catastrophic earthquake back in 2010, where over 100,000 people died. Many people are choosing to be in the street. So one can only imagine the terror, quite frankly, and the fear that people are going to be feeling tonight, where the lights are out, when that rain picks up, when the wind picks up, with loved ones that are underneath rubble. One can only imagine what people are going to be thinking this later on tonight.
Ed, you mentioned that 2010 earthquake. Do Haitians feel like they're reliving this tragedy? And how prepared was the Haitian government, which we know is in a chaotic state right now with the president just assassinated last month? Do we know how prepared they were to really handle another disaster?
Thankfully, this earthquake does not appear to be as awful in terms of death count as the 2010 one. As I just said, between 100,000 and 360,000 people are estimated to have died back in 2010. That's a catastrophic number, possibly up to 1/3 Just imagine how many that is. Confirmed deaths so far are at 1,297. So it seems order of magnitude less. And unfortunately, the Haitian state's capacity to deal with natural disasters, be they hurricanes or earthquakes, has always been severely limited, and more than ever now, perhaps, as COVID cases roil the island, and as the country is trying to recover after the president of the country was assassinated in his own home only 1 month ago. So difficult times and limited capacity to respond.
All right, Ed Augustin, thank you so much for your reporting. Appreciate it. And this morning, as the people in Haiti begin to recover from that devastating earthquake, we are tracking some of the major storms threatening that island and even parts of the U.S.
Yeah, of course. Bill Cairns has the latest for us. Hi, Bill. Good morning.
Hey, good morning. I'll get to Fred in a second, which is the one that's going to hit Florida later on today. And that's actually has some changes, so stay tuned for that. But since we're getting off the topic of Haiti, I want to go into what's happening with Grace. So this storm was a tropical storm, then it weakened to a tropical depression. It still has a lot of rain with it. We're not concerned with the winds whatsoever, but it's going to go right along the southern coast of Haiti. And the southern coast of Haiti has some very tall mountains, and that will wring some of that rain out. So the rainfall is the concern. It is possible up to 10 inches of rain, so mudslides and flash flooding is the big concern, but not the winds. If anything, the storm most likely will just delay the search and rescue efforts, and that can be problematic in itself. The forecast then takes this storm south of Cuba into the southern Gulf of Mexico. Notice that only Brownsville, Texas is in the cone of uncertainty there, so we'll keep an eye on this, but this one does look to avoid all of the northern Gulf Coast, and Grace will miss Florida. Now let's get to Fred, because this storm at 8 p.m. this evening will be coming on shore, making landfall. It looks like it will be a strong tropical storm at that time. Tropical storm warnings for Tallahassee, Panama City included. We have flash flooding that's expected from Panama City to Atlanta. That's where the flash flood watches are. 12 million people at risk. So here's how it looks on radar, and it's actually got some nice band of storms on the north side of it right now. That's why we actually think it's made a little bit of intensification. We'll get that new update from the Hurricane Center at 8 o'clock Eastern time here, but they do expect it to make landfall this evening, and then it will make its way up towards Atlanta and weaken. The winds will never be an issue. It's mostly going to be the rainfall forecast that'll be problematic. Even in Atlanta, we could see up to 5 inches of rain, and then eventually that rain will make its way all the way into the northeast as we head towards the end of this week, guys. So we're watching Fred. There's still a very outside chance it could try to make a run at a hurricane by the end of today, but likely a strong tropical storm at landfall.
All right. Thank you, Bill.
Thanks, Bill.
Let's take a look at what other headlines are making news around the world this morning.
Claudio Lavanga joins us from Rome. Hey, Claudio.
Morning, guys. Well, talking about bad weather, torrential rain has been causing mayhem in Japan over the weekend. On Sunday, at least 3 people were presumed dead and 2 more were injured after their house was hit by a mudslide. Dozens of other people had to be evacuated in areas that were affected by the heavy rain. And the record-breaking heat wave is still upon us. It's boiling over southern Europe. In Spain on Saturday, there was a temperature recorded of 117 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, that is the highest ever recorded in that country, but it is far from the 120 Fahrenheit that were recorded here in Italy, in Sicily specifically, on Wednesday. And last but not least, well, a dancing policeman in India has become an internet sensation. The 39-year-old cop from Mumbai said he always wanted to become a professional dancer. Well, finally, now his moves have attracted millions of viewers on both TikTok and Instagram. I suppose that he would like to swap his parking tickets with tickets to his shows, guys.
Love
good.
that.
All right. Thank you, Claudio.
And coming up, turns out anyone can get the key to New York City as long as they're vaccinated.
We'll tell you about the new vaccination rules in the nation's largest city and where you'll need them next. One of the country's biggest concert and ticketing companies, Live Nation, has announced it will require vaccines or negative COVID tests at its events. Both customers and the artists performing will need to comply starting October 4th. Company employees must also be vaccinated. Live Nation spokesman says the change was designed to encourage vaccination after similar restrictions at Lollapalooza. 12% of attendees said going to the festival was the reason they got their shots. Pretty incredible, huh?
Yeah, that is quite a stat there. Pretty interesting. I guess people that really love music this could be the reason they do it.
Whatever it takes to motivate folks.
All right. Thanks, Joe. Yep. And this morning, COVID cases are reaching a 6-month high as the Delta variant fuels rapid spread of the virus. And now the country's largest city and the former epicenter of the COVID crisis is becoming the first to require proof of vaccination for many indoor activities. It's right here, and it's called the Key to NYC plan. It starts phasing in today and requires customers and employees to have at least one shot for indoor dining, gyms, and concerts. NBC News correspondent Ron Allen joins us now from New York City's Upper East Side. Hi, Ron. Good morning. So I know you've been speaking with business owners about this new mandate, with the big question here being, what do they think about this? Are they happy? What are they telling you?
Well, most business owners are happy, and I think this falls into a couple of categories. If you're vaccinated and you're for vaccines, you're for this, and if you're not, you're not. And it's not just New York, but there's San Francisco, New Orleans also implementing similar things like this. So I think you're going to see more of this. The main objective is to get people vaccinated, to encourage them to get vaccinated. So the argument is, if you want to go to a restaurant in New York, if you want to go to a gym, if you want to go to a concert or an indoor performance of any kind, you need to be vaccinated and be able to prove it. And if you're not, you can't. So it's something of a carrot-stick approach about vaccination. And of course, there's a lot of concern about the Delta variant and the numbers going up, not just here, but even higher in other parts of the country. So we spoke to a gym owner here in New York City who explained why he's supportive of the mandate. Listen to what he had to say.
So for me, keeping my business safe keeps my neighborhood safe. And a lot of the clients that come to the gym live in the area. But I knew that I was going to get some pushback, and I was willing to lose some money to keep people safe. You know, for me, human life is more important than a couple of dollars.
Well, there's obviously been pushback from some people who don't want to have to reveal personal information to a restaurant, to a bar, to a gym, what have you. And there are some people who work at these establishments who don't want to be responsible for enforcing this, and they're against vaccines in general. So this falls into that category as well. So a lot to be sorted out. It goes into effect now. Enforcement starts in mid-September.
So, Ron, let's talk about how it will be enforced and the rollout of this plan. What are the accepted ways to prove that you are vaccinated? Is it just having that little card, a picture of it? What is it? And also, do we know what penalties are for businesses who end up not complying?
Yes, basically it is having that little card, that CDC card, that's your vaccination record. There's a New York State app, and it's called the Excelsior Pass, which has that information. And New York City also just launched an app that has that information in as well. So you have to present those forms of vaccination proof, if you will. How will it be enforced? It's going to be up to the individual businesses to do this. And some are concerned about, well, how are we going to do this? It's an additional responsibility. As you know, the restaurant industry, the hospitality industry generally, has been really hard hit by the last 18 months of COVID. There are literally thousands of them that are out of business. There are, in some cases, labor shortages, but there are also businesses that are just still struggling. And so this is one more thing they have to do. But if the alternative is shutting down or limiting capacity, I think most businesses will take this instead.
And now, Ron, as you mentioned at the top, there are, two sides to this. People who are happy about it and think it's going to make them feel safe and are vaccinated, so it's no problem. And then others where that's not the case. So not all New Yorkers are on board. Yesterday, in fact, there were protests outside the governor's mansion, not far from where you are. What was the message there?
There was a protest, yes, and it was very political in tone, I have to say. It was dominated by Curtis Sliwa, who is the Republican candidate for mayor, and Andrew Giuliani, who is the son of the former mayor here and the candidate for governor, presumably coming up next year. And they were making the arguments that so many other political leaders make in particularly southern states, where they feel that this is an infringement on individual rights, an individual responsibility. And there's this privacy issue. Why should anyone have to reveal this information about health status, about other things, to private businesses? So there's that. But I think overwhelmingly, for the most part, people support this idea here in New York. It's going to have a much more difficult sell to do in places in the South, for example, where there are states, governors, others who are against any kind of mandate, masks, vaccine, you name it.
And where those vaccination rates are much lower, meaning fewer and fewer people would be able to participate in any of these types of activities. All right, Ron Allen, thank you so much. Let's now bring in NBC News medical contributor Dr. Natalie Azar. Hi, doctor. Good morning. So let's kind of talk through some things that have happened over the weekend and some things that might be confusing families. And first, while we're just talking about New York rolling out a vaccine mandate, the Texas Supreme Court just struck down mask mandates in two of the state's most populous counties. So what had gone on there was the governor has actually said you can't mandate masks. And then some counties went ahead and did so, and those were struck down. So we've seen a lot of these rule disputes among different levels of government in various states. But one of these big things that's happening right now is, of course, back to school. So what's your advice for parents who are sending kids back to school in one of these areas where the rules are up in the air and they're just watching it really be fought out by their government?
It's really tough. I mean, I feel very, very lucky that I live in a state where, the local government is following science and requiring masks for students who are, both vaccinated and unvaccinated. I told my teenagers a few weeks ago that they didn't have to wear a mask, and now they're going to be wearing a mask, and they're okay with that because they understand that protects other students who may have not had the chance to be vaccinated. But, I think for parents out there, I think the messaging is, that you need to be very cautious as you move forward in the next couple of weeks. I would say that, you don't necessarily need to feel such anxiety. If you are a parent who wants your child masked, they should be masked. It is certainly more protective if the entire classroom and the staff is masked as well, but it still will offer some protection. And look, as you pointed out, this is a patchwork across the country. It's really startling how differently it's playing out in every single state and every different county. And I think it's a story, unfortunately, we're going to be following for the next few weeks and months, Savannah.
Yeah, I think so, too. You're right, doctor. So now let's talk about booster shots. Over the weekend, the director of the National Institutes of Health said the U.S. is considering them for senior citizens, and actually as early as this fall. Now, this is something that we've seen Israel do for months now. Walk us through the science on this and what a senior citizen should know and be thinking about.
So this is interesting, right? Because the reason that we would offer a booster to seniors, let's say without even checking their antibodies, if you will, is something that's referred to as immune senescence. And what that basically means is that our immune systems start to decline naturally as we age. You know, we've talked a lot about all of the different arms of the immune system, the antibody responses and the T cell responses. These are all really, really important, not only to fight off an initial infection if exposed to coronavirus. It also has to do with how good of an immune response you mount to the vaccine. And it also has to do with how good your immune memory is if you've been infected. The issue is that we haven't really seen seniors hospitalized who have been vaccinated, which is great, which is why the CDC didn't necessarily recommend that seniors in long-term care facilities get a booster right now. In fact, they had a very specific list of individuals who are immunocompromised who would be candidates for a booster. So, you know, I have a lot of opinion on the CDC recommendations. I would say that I wouldn't be surprised if seniors are offered boosters, but I would say that real world evidence at the moment does not seem to imply that their immunity has been waning because they have not been hospitalized in record numbers. In fact, we see that their protection has been quite dramatic from vaccination.
All right, Dr. Azar, thank you so much. And coming up, criminals are masking up to steal COVID cash from unemployed Americans. How some fraudsters are using 3D printed disguises to steal hundreds of billions in unemployment insurance. That's up next. New information is coming to light this morning about a massive international fraud operation aimed at taking advantage of the pandemic. Hackers scamming the U.S. government out of millions of dollars in relief aid. They used things like 3D printed masks to steal Americans' identities and get information to put in false unemployment claims that impacted 2,000 plus people. NBC News correspondent Ken Delanian has more.
These are the faces of fraud, criminals doing whatever it takes to steal COVID cash. The silicone masks, an attempt to trick facial recognition software.
We've seen attacks from over 100 countries across the world.
Blake Hall is CEO of ID.me, which is working with more than 24 states to stop the theft of unemployment benefits. He estimates that as much as $400 billion has been stolen from COVID jobless programs alone. Half by foreign criminals, Russian mobsters, Chinese hackers, Nigerian scammers who siphoned the money overseas.
This is like letting people just walk right into Fort Knox and take the gold, and nobody even asks any questions.
When states made it easier to apply for COVID benefits online, that also made it easier for crooks to pose as jobless Americans, using stolen personal information purchased in the dark corners of the internet. After ID.me started requiring selfie verification, fraudsters went to extraordinary lengths.
We've seen everything from Halloween masks to 3D printed masks to Barbie dolls that folks will put up there.
It's definitely an economic attack on the United States.
And on Americans. When Yvonne Matlock lost her job last year and applied for benefits online, she was told she was already getting relief money.
Somebody had just had gotten a hold of my Social Security number and was able to set up an account in my name.
The FBI and Secret Service have opened more than 3,000 investigations. Earlier this month, a Nigerian oil company engineer was charged with submitting more than 250 fraudulent claims in 17 U.S. states, allegedly stealing almost $300,000 while sitting in Nigeria.
We'll probably never know exactly how much money was stolen. At the end of the day, we'll know exactly how much we get back and how many people we're able to put in jail.
All right, our thanks to Ken Delanian for that stunning report. Coming up, families are breaking the bank to get their kids back to school. It's not just notebooks and backpacks that will cost you more. The other items that will stretch your budget and how you can get around those skyrocketing prices up next.
As kids go back to school, parents are facing major challenges buying them what they need, not just pencils and notebooks, but also things like clothes and backpacks.
Yeah, and instead of back to school deals, shoppers are seeing shortages and price hikes. NBC News consumer and investigative correspondent Vicki Nguyen has more on how to get what you need and save.
Joe and Savannah, good morning. As students across the country get ready to hit the books again, parents are bracing to shell out more this year. Experts say now is the time to start shopping. This morning, I'm showing you how to get what you need and save more than 60% on some items. Back to school shopping is anything but typical this year.
I feel like was overwhelming.
We're just taking whatever is available.
I found myself having to shop in the boys section because the girls section was completely cleared out.
Parents across the country sounding off about their back to school shopping woes.
I was surprised how much money I had to spend.
According to the National Retail Federation, families are planning to spend an average of almost $850 on school items. That's nearly $60 more than last year.
It is more expensive this year.
Be flexible.
Neil Saunders is the managing partner at Global Data. He says supply chain challenges mean product shortages and fewer discounts. What are some of the items where you anticipate some shortages or that might be harder to find?
Backpacks, for example, sneakers, apparel, technology products like laptops, and also things like desks.
Why is there going to be such a rush on apparel this year?
Consumers did not buy lots of clothes last year for kids, and now they're going back to school.
If you want the best prices and selection, shop around and shop early. That's exactly what my team did. Backpacks were all picked over at this store in New Jersey, but just 5 miles away, we found backpacks fully stocked. Why is it that we won't see the same kind of sales and discounts that we typically do?
We often see the sales and discounts to stimulate demand and to clear down stock. And the truth is retailers just don't need to do that this year because demand is very, very high.
So how do you save money? It's actually pretty easy. First, install a free browser extension like Honey. With this Honey browser, you can actually track the price history of an item. For example, take a look at this tablet. I know it's down to $120 now. That's $30 cheaper than it was just a month ago, so this is a good time to buy. Honey also looks for discount codes at the more than 40,000 retailers it supports. Also, check the resale market. We found lunchboxes and craft supplies on Facebook Marketplace and a whole bunch of laptops and tablets deeply discounted on Swappa. It's a marketplace for gently used tech. And check out websites like ThredUp for gently used kids' clothes. Look, we found these Levi's for 61% off. Kitizen and Mercari are also great stops to find deals on secondhand kids' clothes. And one of the easiest tools to use right here on Google Shop. All you do is type in the specific item you're looking for. The more details, the better. The brand, the color. Google will do the searching for you and allow you to compare prices for where to buy. Tips to help you find everything on your list and save money. If you're shopping last minute, expand your search. For example, if you need backpacks, go beyond the big box stores and department stores. Try small businesses and sporting goods stores. Joe and Savannah, back to you.
Good advice. And that does it for this hour of Morning News Now.
But the news continues right now.